Stephen stepped into the CEO's office expecting the worst: a termination, a demotion, or removal from the biggest project of his career. But the powerful woman behind the desk wasn't talking about work. She closed the door, lowered her voice, and whispered 5 words that shattered his world. "I'm pregnant, and it's yours." One night, one mistake buried 3 months ago. Now it had returned to collect its debt. Ellie Sterling, the untouchable ice queen of Sterling and Associates, sat across from him, waiting for his response, the only question left hanging. Would he run or step into the storm? Before we dive deeper into Stephen's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how this incredible journey unfolds. Stephen Thompson had spent the last 9 years building a life that left no room for mistakes. As a senior project manager at Sterling and Associates, one of the most prestigious financial consulting firms in the country, he understood the unwritten rules better than anyone. Be early, be prepared, be invisible when necessary, indispensable when it mattered. Never give them a reason to question you. Being a black man in a boardroom full of people who didn't look like him had taught Stephen one fundamental truth: perfection wasn't optional, it was survival. He had learned this lesson long before corporate America. He had learned it watching his father work double shifts only to be passed over for promotions that went to less qualified men. He had learned it in college, where professors questioned whether his scholarship was truly merit-based. And he had learned it most painfully 9 years ago, standing in a hospital room holding his wife's hand as she took her last breath. Sarah had been the love of his life, when a drunk driver ran a red light and changed everything. Stephen was left with a 3-year-old daughter and a grief so heavy he thought it might crush him. But Zoe needed him, so he did what he always did. He kept moving, kept working, kept being perfect. Now, sitting across from Ellie Sterling in her corner office on the 42nd floor, Stephen felt all that carefully constructed perfection crumbling. Ellie was everything the business magazines described: sharp, calculated, relentless. At 42, she had clawed her way to the top of a company founded by her father, proving to every doubter that she belonged in that chair. The financial press called her the Ice Queen, a title she had never bothered to dispute. In the 3 years Stephen had worked under her leadership, he had seen her reduce executives to stammering messes with a single raised eyebrow. But right now, her hands were trembling. "I've been to 3 doctors," Ellie said, her voice stripped of its usual authority. "The results are conclusive. I'm 12 weeks along." Stephen stared at her, his mind racing through calculations he didn't want to make. 12 weeks. That meant the company anniversary party. Ellie continued reading his thoughts. 3 months ago. The memory hit Stephen like a physical blow. That night had been an aberration, a crack in both their carefully maintained facades. He remembered staying late to finish a presentation, noticing the light still on in her office well past midnight. He remembered knocking on her door, expecting to find her reviewing quarterly reports. Instead, he found her sitting on the floor, mascara streaked down her face, an empty glass beside her. "My mother died this afternoon," she had told him, her voice hollow. "I was in a meeting when it happened, a meeting I scheduled because I thought I had more time." Stephen had never seen Ellie vulnerable. He didn't even know she was capable of it. But that night, she wasn't the Ice Queen or the CEO or anyone's boss. She was just a woman who had lost her mother, sitting alone in an office because she had no one else to call. He should have left, should have offered his condolences and walked away. But something about her grief had unlocked something in his own. He found himself sitting beside her, talking about Sarah, about loss, about the guilt that never quite faded. One conversation became 2 drinks became something neither of them planned. In the morning, They had agreed without discussion. It never happened. They would return to their roles, boss and employee, CEO and project manager, and pretend that moment of weakness didn't exist. But biology had other plans. "I'm telling you this as a courtesy," Ellie said now, her composure slowly reconstructing itself. "I've already consulted my legal team. There's no obligation on your part. No one needs to know you're involved." She reached into her desk and pulled out a folder, sliding it across to him. Stephen recognized the gesture. It was the same efficient motion she used in board meetings when presenting acquisition offers. "These are your options," she continued. "Option 1, complete confidentiality. I handle this privately, and your name never appears in any documentation. Option 2, a formal agreement outlining limited parental rights and financial obligations. Option 3, stop." The word came out harder than Stephen intended. "Just stop." Ellie's eyes widened slightly, the only indication that his interruption had surprised her. "You're presenting this like a quarterly report," Stephen said. "Like it's a problem to be managed. Because that's what it is." Ellie's voice had recovered its edge. "I didn't plan this. I've never wanted children, and I certainly never intended to complicate both our careers with a scandal that could destroy everything we've built. So, what are you going to do?" The question hung between them, for the first time. Stephen saw something flicker across Ellie's face. Uncertainty. The Ice Queen didn't have an answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "That's why I needed to tell you first before I make any decisions." Stephen stood, moving to the window. 42 floors below, the city churned with people who had no idea his world had just tilted off its axis. He thought about Zoe home right now with the babysitter, probably doing homework or watching videos on her tablet. He thought about what this would mean for her. A father suddenly entangled with his boss, their family becoming office gossip. He thought about Sarah and what she would tell him to do. "Don't live like life is a prison sentence," she used to say. "You're so afraid of making mistakes that you forget to actually live." "I need time to think," Stephen said finally. Of course, Ellie's professional mask was back in place. "Take whatever time you need. My door's open when you're ready to discuss options." Options. There was that word again, as if they were negotiating a contract instead of discussing a child. Stephen left her office without another word. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every red light and opportunity for his mind to spiral into worst-case scenarios. His career was built on being above reproach. What would happen when people found out he had slept with his boss? It didn't matter that it was one night, that they were both single adults, that no professional boundaries had been crossed before or since. The story would write itself. Ambitious black employee sleeps his way into CEO's favor. He could already hear the whispered assumptions, see the knowing looks from colleagues who had always searched for reasons to doubt him. When Stephen finally pulled into his driveway, the porch light was on and he could see Zoe's silhouette in the living room window. His daughter, his reason for everything. Inside, the babysitter gave her usual report. Homework done, dinner eaten, only 30 minutes of screen time, and left with a cheerful wave. Stephen found Zoe curled up on the couch with a book, her reading glasses slightly askew. At 12, Zoe was already showing signs of the woman she would become. Smart, observant, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn determination. She had been 3 when Sarah died, young enough that her memories of her mother came mostly from photographs and stories Stephen told her. Sometimes he caught her staring at old pictures, trying to hold on to something she could barely remember. "Hey, Dad." Zoe looked up from her book. "You're home late. Meeting ran long." The lie came easily, and Stephen hated himself for it. Zoe studied him with that unsettling perceptiveness she had inherited from Sarah. "You okay? You look weird." "Just tired." Another lie. They were stacking up quickly. Stephen busied himself in the kitchen reheating leftovers he had no appetite for. Through the pass-through window, He could see Zoe pretending to read while actually watching him. She always knew when something was wrong. She just didn't always push. Tonight, she pushed. "Dad." Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You can tell me if something's going on. I'm not a little kid anymore." Stephen looked at his daughter, this fierce, brilliant girl who had already survived more loss than most adults. She deserved better than a father who hid things from her. But she also deserved a father who had all the answers. And right now, Stephen had nothing but questions. "It's just work stuff," he said. "Nothing you need to worry about." Zoe's expression flickered with something that looked like disappointment. "Okay." She turned and walked back to the living room. Stephen stood alone in the kitchen, the microwave humming beside him, and thought about all the ways his life was about to change. That night, after Zoe had gone to bed, Stephen sat in his home office, staring at a photograph of Sarah on his desk. They had taken it on their honeymoon, her laughing, him pretending to complain about the camera angle. "What would you tell me to do?" he whispered to the photograph. Sarah, of course, didn't answer, but he could imagine what she might say. "Since when do you run from hard things?" The truth was, he had been running for years, running into work, into routine, into the safety of being so perfect that no one could ever find fault. He had convinced himself it was for Zoe, for stability, for survival. But maybe it was just fear wearing a more respectable mask. The next morning, Stephen arrived at Sterling and Associates an hour early. Ellie was already in her office. She was always in her office, visible through the glass walls that separated the executive suite from the rest of the floor. He knocked once and entered without waiting for an invitation. Ellie looked up from her computer, her face carefully neutral. "Have you made a decision about which option? I'm not picking from a menu." Stephen interrupted. "Whatever you decide about this pregnancy, I need you to know something. I'm not going to disappear. I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. And I'm not going to let you handle this alone just because it's more convenient for everyone." Ellie stared at him as if he had started speaking a foreign language. "Do you understand what you're saying?" she asked quietly. "If people find out. I know exactly what happens if people find out. I've been calculating those risks my entire life." Stephen took a breath. "But I have a daughter at home who's going to grow up and ask me what kind of man I am. And I refused to be the kind of man who walks away because it's easier." Ellie was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its sharp edge. "You're either very brave or very stupid. Probably both." Something almost like a smile crossed Ellie's face just for a second, just at the corners. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of control. "I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet," she said about the pregnancy. "I know," Stephen replied, "but whatever you decide, you won't be making that decision alone." He turned and left her office, feeling the weight of every eye on the floor following him through the glass walls. The storm was coming, but for the first time in years, Stephen Thompson wasn't running from it. The first whisper reached Stephen 3 days later. He was standing at the coffee machine on the 38th floor when he overheard 2 junior analysts talking behind the partition. They didn't know he was there, and they didn't bother lowering their voices. "Did you see Thompson coming out of her office again this morning, 3rd time this week? I heard he's been getting all the premium assignments lately. Must be nice to have that kind of access." Stephen's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He had spent his entire career avoiding exactly this kind of speculation. Now it was finding him anyway, and the worst part was that the rumors weren't entirely wrong, just wrong in all the ways that mattered. He walked back to his desk without acknowledging the analysts, feeling their eyes follow him across the floor. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere at Sterling and Associates shifted in ways that were difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. Stephen noticed colleagues who used to stop by his desk for casual conversation suddenly finding reasons to be elsewhere, Meeting invitations that once included him as a matter of course now arrived late or not at all. The change was subtle enough to deny, but consistent enough to feel. Ellie, for her part, maintained her usual distance in public. She treated Stephen exactly as she treated every other senior manager, with professional courtesy and nothing more. But Stephen could see the strain wearing on her. The morning sickness she tried to hide by scheduling earlier meetings, the way she gripped the edge of her desk during long presentations, the careful loosening of her usually impeccable wardrobe. She was 16 weeks pregnant now, and the secret was becoming harder to keep. One Thursday afternoon, Stephen was called into a conference room for what his calendar described as a routine project review. Instead, he found himself facing Helen Cross, the head of human resources, and two members of the legal team he didn't recognize. "Mr. Thompson," Helen began, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, "we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us." "Of course." Stephen kept his voice steady. "What's this about? Just some standard questions regarding your recent interactions with Ms. Sterling." Helen opened a folder in front of her. "We've noticed you've had an unusual number of private meetings with the CEO over the past month, more than your position would typically require." Stephen felt the walls closing in. "Miss Sterling has been consulting me on several high-priority projects. Our meetings have all been work-related. I'm sure they have." Helen's tone suggested otherwise. "However, given the company's policies on workplace relationships, we need to ensure that all professional boundaries are being maintained." The questions continued for another 45 minutes. When did these meetings start? What was discussed? Had there been any personal contact outside of work hours? Stephen answered each question carefully, truthfully, where he could, evasively where he had to. By the time he left the conference room, his shirt was damp with sweat. That evening, he found Ellie waiting by his car in the parking garage. "I heard about your meeting with HR," she said without preamble. "I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened." Stephen glanced around, checking for security cameras for other employees, for anyone who might see them together. "It's fine. I handled it." "It's not fine." Ellie's voice carried an edge he rarely heard. Anger, but not directed at him. "Someone on the board is fishing for information. They've been questioning my leadership for months, and now they think they found ammunition. What are you going to do?" Ellie didn't answer immediately. In the harsh fluorescent light of the garage, she looked exhausted in a way that makeup couldn't hide. "I don't know yet, but I need you to understand something. If this becomes public, if anyone finds out about us, you'll be the one who suffers most. People will say you manipulated your way into my favor. They'll question every promotion, every project, every success you've ever had. I know. Do you?" Ellie stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Because I've spent 20 years in this industry, I know how these stories end. The woman gets called ambitious. The man gets called predatory. And if the man happens to be black..." She stopped herself, but the implication hung between them. Stephen had lived that reality his entire career. He didn't need her to spell it out. "I knew the risks when I told you I wouldn't walk away," he said. "That hasn't changed." Ellie studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once and walked toward her own car without another word. At home, Zoe was waiting with a look that Stephen had come to dread. The look that said she had questions he wasn't ready to answer. "Mrs. Patterson next door asked me something weird today," Zoe said as Stephen hung up his coat. "She wanted to know if you were dating anyone." Stephen froze. "What did you tell her?" "I said no. Was I supposed to say something else?" "No. That was the right answer." Zoe crossed her arms. "Dad, you've been acting strange for weeks. Coming home late, checking your phone constantly, barely eating dinner." "Whatever's going on. I can handle it." Stephen looked at his daughter. This 12-year-old girl who had already handled more than any child should. She had lost her mother at 3. She had watched her father disappear into work and grief. She had learned to make her own breakfast and help with laundry and be independent in ways that sometimes broke his heart. She deserved the truth, but the truth would change everything, and Stephen wasn't sure either of them was ready for that. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Work stuff. I promise I'll explain when I can." The disappointment in Zoe's eyes cut deeper than any HR interrogation. "You always say that." She turned and walked to her room, closing the door with a soft click that felt louder than a slam. 3 weeks later, the crisis Stephen had been dreading arrived without warning. He was in a budget meeting when his phone buzzed with an emergency notification. Ellie Sterling had collapsed during a board presentation and was being rushed to the hospital. Stephen left the meeting without explanation, ignoring the confused looks from his colleagues. The drive to the hospital took 17 minutes, each one feeling like an hour. By the time he reached the emergency department, Ellie had already been moved to a private room, and a cluster of executives from Sterling and Associates were gathered in the waiting area, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Stephen recognized the chief operating officer, the head of investor relations, and 2 board members. None of them looked happy to see him. Thompson, the COO, a silver-haired man named Richard Hayes, stepped forward with barely concealed suspicion. "What are you doing here? I heard Ms. Sterling was hospitalized. I wanted to make sure she was okay." "That's very considerate of you." Richard's tone made clear it was anything but. "However, this is a matter for senior leadership. I'm sure you understand." Before Stephen could respond, a nurse emerged from the hallway. "Is there a Stephen Thompson here? Miss Sterling is asking for him." The silence that followed was deafening. Stephen could feel the weight of every stare as he walked past the executives and followed the nurse down the corridor. Ellie lay in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors that beeped with quiet regularity, without her armor of designer suits and perfectly applied makeup. She looked smaller somehow, more human. "Close the door," she said as Stephen entered. He did, then stood at the foot of her bed, unsure what to say. "Pre-eclampsia," Ellie said before he could ask. "Early onset. The doctors say it's manageable if I reduce my stress and take it easy." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Take it easy, as if that's an option. What does this mean for the pregnancy?" Ellie turned to look out the window. The city skyline was visible in the distance, the Sterling and Associates building a gleaming tower among dozens of others. "It means I have to choose my career or this baby because apparently I can't have both." Stephen moved to the chair beside her bed and sat down. "That's not true. There are ways to manage this. Delegating responsibilities, adjusting your schedule. You don't understand." Ellie's voice cracked just slightly before she regained control. "I've spent my entire life proving I belong in that corner office. My father never believed I could run his company. Half the board still thinks I got the job because of my last name. If I show any weakness now, they'll use it to push me out. So, you'd rather risk your health? Risk the baby?" The question hung in the air. Ellie didn't answer for a long time. "My mother gave up everything for her family. She finally said she was brilliant, could have been anything she wanted. But she married my father and spent 30 years being his support system, raising his children, managing his household. And you know what she got for it? She died alone in a nursing home while I was too busy proving I wasn't her to be there." Stephen saw tears forming in Ellie's eyes, though she blinked them away before they could fall. "I swore I would never be like her." Ellie continued, "Never dependent on anyone, never giving up my ambitions for someone else." And now she placed a hand on her stomach, a gesture so unconscious she probably didn't realize she was doing it. "Now, I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Stephen reached out and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched since that night 3 months ago. "You're not your mother," he said quietly. "And this doesn't have to be a choice between everything or nothing. But you can't do this alone. No one can." Ellie looked at their joined hands, but didn't pull away. The board is going to find out about us. About the baby. Richard Hayes has been building a case against me for months. This will give him exactly what he needs. Then we get ahead of it." Ellie's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. I've spent my entire life trying to be invisible," Stephen said. "Trying to be so perfect that no one could ever have a reason to doubt me. And you know what? They doubt me anyway. They always have. At least this time I get to choose what I'm being judged for." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A doctor entered, chart in hand, and began explaining Ellie's treatment plan. Bed rest, medication, regular monitoring. The baby was stable for now, but the next few months would require careful management. Stephen listened, asked questions, took notes on his phone. When the doctor left, Ellie was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You could walk away." "Protect your career, your reputation. No one would blame you." Stephen thought about Zoe, about the look of disappointment in her eyes when he kept choosing easy lies over hard truths. He thought about Sarah, about the life they had built together before it was stolen from them. He thought about the man he wanted to be versus the man he had become. "Because my daughter is going to ask me someday what I did when things got hard," he said. "And I want to be able to look her in the eye when I answer." 2 days later, Stephen stood before the Sterling and Associates Board of Directors. The conference room on the 45th floor was designed to intimidate. Florida-to-ceiling windows. A table that could seat 30 portraits of company founders lining the walls. Richard Hayes sat at the head of the table, flanked by board members who watched Stephen with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Ellie was still in the hospital, but she had arranged this meeting before Stephen could talk her out of it. "Mr. Thompson," Richard began, "we've asked you here to clarify certain rumors that have been circulating regarding your relationship with Ms. Sterling." Stephen stood at the end of the table, refusing the offered seat. "I'm happy to clarify. I am the father of Ms. Sterling's child. Our relationship occurred outside of work hours and has not affected any professional decisions at this company." The room erupted. Board members spoke over each other, demanding explanations, expressing outrage, questioning everything from Stephen's integrity to Ellie's judgment. Richard Hayes leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man whose suspicions had just been confirmed. "This is exactly the kind of scandal we cannot afford," Richard declared when the noise subsided. "Our clients trust us with billions of dollars. If word gets out that our CEO has been conducting inappropriate relationships with subordinates, there was nothing inappropriate about it." Stephen's voice cut through the murmurs. 2 single adults made a personal choice that had nothing to do with this company. What's inappropriate is treating Miss Sterling's pregnancy as a scandal instead of a private matter. You're in no position to lecture us about propriety." Richard snapped. "Your judgment is clearly compromised. My judgment has delivered 3 of the highest-performing projects in company history over the past 2 years. My judgment helped secure the Morrison account when everyone else said it was impossible. My judgment is the reason I'm standing here instead of running from a situation that would be easier to ignore." The board members exchanged glances. Stephen could see the calculation happening behind their eyes, the weighing of risk against reward, reputation against results. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked a woman at the far end of the table. Margaret Powell, the longest-serving board member and someone Stephen had always respected. "I'm proposing that we handle this like professionals," Stephen replied. "Ms. Sterling's medical condition requires accommodation. I'm prepared to formally declare our relationship to HR and accept whatever oversight the board deems appropriate. But I will not pretend this child doesn't exist, and I will not let you use this situation to undermine a CEO who has increased company profits by 37% in 3 years. The vote took less than 10 minutes, 7-5 in favor of allowing Ellie to continue in her role with increased board oversight and mandatory disclosure of her pregnancy to senior leadership. It wasn't a complete victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. As Stephen left the conference room, Margaret Powell stopped him in the hallway. "That took courage," she said. "More courage than most men in your position would have shown. It didn't feel like courage. It felt like the only option." Margaret smiled slightly. "That's usually what courage feels like." When Stephen visited Ellie in the hospital that evening, she had already heard the news. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did." Ellie was quiet for a moment, staring at the ceiling. "I've been thinking about what you said about not doing this alone." She turned to face him. "I'm going to take the medical leave. Let Richard Hayes run day-to-day operations for the next few months. Focus on getting through this pregnancy safely." Stephen felt something loosen in his chest. "That sounds like a good plan. But there's something else." Ellie's voice hardened with familiar resolve. "When this baby is born, I need you to understand, I can't promise anything. Not a relationship, not a family. I don't know how to do those things. I've spent 42 years making sure I never had to learn. I'm not asking for promises." "Then what are you asking for?" Stephen considered the question carefully. "A chance. That's all. A chance to figure this out together instead of separately." Ellie held his gaze for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. The weeks that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Ellie worked from home, attending board meetings by video conference and delegating responsibilities she had never trusted anyone else to handle. Stephen continued his projects at the office, weathering knowing looks and whispered conversations with the same quiet determination he had carried his entire career. But the strain was taking its toll on both of them. One evening, Ellie called Stephen with news that her doctors were pleased with her progress. The baby was healthy. The preeclampsia was under control. If everything continued on track, she could potentially return to the office in her 3rd trimester. "That's wonderful," Stephen said, genuinely relieved. "There's more." Ellie's voice carried an unusual weight. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about this situation, about what happens after the baby is born." Stephen waited, sensing what was coming. "I think it's better if we end this now," Ellie continued. "Whatever this is, you go back to your life. I go back to mine. The baby will have every advantage, the best schools, the best opportunities. I can provide everything a child needs, everything except a father." Ellie's silence confirmed what Stephen already knew. "This isn't about what I want," she finally said. "This is about what's practical. Your career is just starting to recover from the board meeting. Zoe needs stability, not more upheaval. And her voice wavered slightly. "I'm not built for partnership. I never have been." Stephen thought about arguing, thought about all the reasons her logic was flawed, all the ways she was using practicality to mask fear. But he also thought about Zoe, still frustrated about secrets he had kept, about his own exhaustion, fighting battles on every front. Maybe Ellie was right. Maybe this was the rational choice. "If that's what you want," he heard himself saying. "It's what's best for everyone." Stephen hung up the phone and sat in his dark living room for a long time, feeling something he couldn't quite name settle into his chest. The next morning, he told Zoe a partial truth that there was a complicated situation at work involving someone he cared about, that it was difficult, but that he was stepping back from it now. Zoe listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked only one question. "Did you end it, or did she?" "She did. It was the right decision." Zoe studied her father with those 2 old eyes. The right decision or the easy one? Stephen didn't have an answer. In the weeks that followed, life returned to something resembling normal. Stephen threw himself back into work. Zoe started 8th grade. Ellie's name appeared less frequently in office conversations, replaced by speculation about Richard Hayes's expanding influence. It was over. They had both made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences, or so Stephen thought. 2 weeks after their final conversation. Stephen received a call from an unknown number at 11:30 at night. He almost didn't answer. Work calls never came this late, and he had stopped expecting to hear from Ellie. But something made him pick up anyway. Some instinct he couldn't explain. "Mr. Thompson." The voice was professional clinical. "This is Dr. Reeves from St. Catherine's Medical Center. You're listed as the emergency contact for Ellie Sterling. The hospital system shows you were never removed from her file." Stephen was already reaching for his car keys before the doctor finished explaining. Ellie had been found unconscious in her home by her housekeeper. Severe exhaustion, dehydration, early signs of organ stress. She had been working 18-hour days since their conversation, attending video meetings from her bed, refusing to let anyone see how badly she was struggling. The baby was stable. Ellie was not. When Stephen arrived at the hospital, he found her room empty except for the machines monitoring her vitals and a laptop still open on the bedside table, its screen displaying an unfinished email to the board of directors. She was awake, but barely. The woman who had commanded boardrooms and intimidated executives looked hollowed out, her face gaunt and her eyes shadowed with something deeper than physical exhaustion. "You shouldn't be here," Ellie said when she saw him. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Your doctor called me. I thought I had them remove you from my contacts." Stephen pulled the chair close to her bed and sat down. "They said I was never taken off the system." Ellie closed her eyes briefly. "I kept meaning to do it. I never did." Stephen didn't point out what that might mean. Instead, he simply said, "I'm here now." Ellie turned her face toward the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, indifferent to the drama playing out in this small hospital room. "I had everything under control. You nearly killed yourself." The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. Ellie didn't deny them. "I thought I could handle it," she finally said. "I've handled everything else alone. My career, my father's expectations, my mother's death. I thought this would be the same. But it's not." Ellie's hand moved to her stomach. That same unconscious gesture Stephen had noticed months ago. "The doctor says the baby is fine. Strong heartbeat, normal development. She's a fighter." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "She takes after her mother." Stephen felt something shift in his chest. I found out last week I was going to Ellie," stopped shaking her head. "It doesn't matter. I made my decision. This is my responsibility, not yours." "You're right," Stephen said. "You made a decision, but you made it for the wrong reasons." Ellie's eyes finally met his. "What do you know about my reasons? I know you're scared. I know you spent your whole life building walls because you watched your mother give up everything and you swore you'd never be that vulnerable. I know you think pushing me away is some kind of strength." Stephen leaned forward. "But I also know that lying in a hospital bed alone, working yourself to death because you're too proud to ask for help, that's not strength." "Ellie, that's just another kind of giving up." Ellie's composure cracked just slightly. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to need someone. I don't know how to be a mother or a partner or anything other than what I've always been. Neither do I." Stephen took her hand, feeling her fingers tense, and then slowly relax. "I've spent 9 years being so afraid of making mistakes that I forgot how to actually live. My daughter had to point that out to me. 12 years old and she's wiser than I am." A tear slipped down Ellie's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that walking away from you wasn't noble. It wasn't mature or practical or any of the things I told myself. It was just easier than staying and figuring out something hard." And now Stephen thought about Zoe's question, the one that had haunted him for weeks. The right decision or the easy one? "Now I'm choosing the hard thing," he said. "If you'll let me." Ellie was quiet for a long time. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, somewhere down the hall. A nurse laughed at something a colleague said. "I can't promise you anything." Ellie finally whispered. I don't know how to be what you need. I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for a chance to figure this out together, whatever that looks like. Ellie's grip on his hand tightened. Together. She repeated as if testing how the word felt in her mouth, before Stephen could respond. His phone buzzed. A text from Zoe. Dad? Where are you? It's almost midnight. He showed Ellie the screen. I need to talk to my daughter. Really talk to her this time. No more half-truths. Ellie nodded. She deserves that. So do you. Stephen stood still, holding her hand. I'll be back tomorrow and the day after that and every day until you stop trying to push me away, for the first time since he had known her. Ellie Sterling smiled without any walls behind it. You're very stubborn. You have no idea. The conversation with Zoe happened the next morning over breakfast. Stephen told her everything. The night with Ellie, the pregnancy, the board meeting, the decision to walk away, and the realization that walking away was its own kind of cowardice. Zoe listened without interrupting, her cereal growing soggy in her bowl. When Stephen finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, Do you love her? Stephen had been asking himself the same question. I don't know yet. What I do know is that I can't abandon her and I can't keep lying to you about who I am and what I'm doing. Zoe nodded slowly, processing. Is the baby going to be my sister, half-sister? Yes. Another long silence. Stephen braced himself for anger, for rejection, for the kind of teenage outrage he probably deserved. Instead, Zoe said, I always wanted a sibling. Mom used to say maybe someday. But then she stopped, swallowing hard. I didn't think it would happen like this. Neither did I. Zoe looked at her father with those two wise eyes. You've been different lately. Sad, but also more, I don't know, more real. Like you're actually here instead of just going through the motions. Stephen felt tears prick his eyes. I'm trying to be. Zoe stood and walked around the table. Then she did something she hadn't done in months. She hugged him. A real hug, tight and fierce. Don't mess this up, she said into his shoulder. I'll do my best. And bring her over sometime. Ellie, I want to meet the person who finally made you stop being so careful all the time. Stephen laughed, the sound surprising both of them. I think she'd like that. 4 months later, Stephen sat in a hospital waiting room for the third time that year. But this time, everything was different. Zoe sat beside him, her leg bouncing with nervous energy. She had insisted on coming, had practically threatened mutiny if Stephen tried to leave her behind. What's taking so long? Zoe asked for the 4th time in 20 minutes. Babies come on their own schedule. That's a non-answer. Stephen smiled. You're right. It is. The months since Ellie's collapse had been anything but easy. There were difficult conversations with the board, negotiations about Ellie's reduced schedule, awkward dinners where Zoe and Ellie sized each other up like wary cats. But there had also been unexpected moments of grace. Ellie asking Zoe about her favorite books and actually listening to the answers. Zoe helping Ellie pick out baby furniture. Offering opinions with the confidence of someone who had been waiting her whole life for this role. The 3 of them eating takeout on Ellie's living room floor, laughing about nothing in particular. It wasn't a fairy tale. Ellie still worked too much and struggled to express emotion. Stephen still caught himself trying to be perfect instead of present. Zoe still had moments of resentment about changes she hadn't asked for, but they were trying. All of them. And somehow that felt like enough. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Thompson. She's asking for you. Stephen stood, his heart pounding. Zoe grabbed his hand. Can I come? 2. Stephen looked at the nurse, who smiled and nodded. They walked down the corridor together, father and daughter, toward a room where everything was about to change again. Ellie lay in the hospital bed, exhausted but radiant in a way Stephen had never seen. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. "Come meet your daughter," Ellie said, her voice thick with emotion. Stephen moved to her side, Zoe close behind. The baby was tiny and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that blinked open to study this strange new world. "She's beautiful," Zoe breathed. Ellie looked up at Stephen, tears streaming freely down her face. "You came. I told you I would." I know." Ellie reached for his hand with her free one. "I'm starting to believe you." Zoe leaned closer to examine her new sister. What's her name? Ellie and Stephen exchanged a glance. They had discussed this, debated it through late-night phone calls and quiet moments stolen between responsibilities. "Grace." Ellie said her name is Grace. Stephen felt something break open in his chest. Not pain, but release. All the years of careful perfection, of hiding behind walls of competence and control, of being so afraid of judgment that he had forgotten how to live, standing in that hospital room with his daughter, his newborn child, and the woman who had shattered every expectation he ever had. Stephen Thompson finally understood what his wife had tried to tell him all those years ago. Life wasn't a prison sentence to be served perfectly. It was a choice to be made over and over again, every single day. He had spent his whole life afraid of being seen wrong, afraid that one mistake would define him, would confirm every doubt and prejudice he had ever faced. But he had been wrong about what defined a man. It wasn't the absence of mistakes. It was what you did after you made them. It was standing up when walking away was easier. It was choosing love over fear, presence over perfection, family over facade. Zoe reached out and touched Grace's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled around her sister's, holding on tight. 3 generations, 2 broken families, 1 new beginning. Not perfect, not traditional, not anything Stephen had ever planned, but built on choice. Not accident, on courage, not convenience, on the simple, terrifying decision to stay. Stephen looked at Ellie, at Zoe, at the tiny life they had created together. "Welcome to the family, Grace," he said softly, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Stephen Thompson wasn't afraid of what came next. Thank you so much for staying with Stephen's story until the very end. Stories like this remind us that family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. If this story moved you, I'd love for you to subscribe and join this community. We share stories every week about real people facing impossible choices and finding their way through. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me what part touched you most.